Like most intruders, I'm starting at the rear of the Waddington shank with my thread right up against the rear eye, tying in with strong wraps, and then clipping my tag off. Next step is to tie in my double looped firewire, laying it on top of the shank. And for length, I just measure it and just match the length of my Waddington shank to my firewire, and then tie it off. Just want to tie it down the length of the shank so that it's wrapped in good and solid, and then I zap-a-gap the shank as well so that it just bonds the firewire to the shank. See, I just pulled the tag back and wrapped over it just to lock it in doubly. And I wrap forward to the eye of the shank, or front, and apply a little bit of zap-a-gap, and then tie in a bead chain eye. I'm using a large silver bead chain. These are 25mm Waddington shanks. If you're using a larger Waddington shank, like a 35, you can move to an extra large bead chain if you wish. After I'm done, I just tie all the way back to the rear of the shank, and I'm just going to do a collar with orange polar bear. And I'm just moving around the shank, tying in 4 or 5 separate pieces of fiber matching length so that it flares out away from the shank, making a nice flared collar. This gives a good look to the fly, but it also acts as a support for the rhea so that it doesn't collapse. It keeps a nice high profile and bulk to the fly. I'm just moving around the shank, tying in pieces of material so that it makes a nice full collar. You'll see that the length of material I'm actually extending right to the end of the firewire trailer, so it's about 1 inch long. After about 4 pieces of material, just make sure that there's no open spots in the collar, and if you need to add a little bit of material, just do so at that time so that the collar is good and full. Just wrap back, make sure that the collar is flared well, then tie in a piece of orange UV polar chenille. Kind of sweep the fiber back so that it wraps so that none of the stray fibers are catching in underneath. And just wrap it forward like hackle, about 1/3 of the way up the shank. And then just tie it off. See, I'm just brushing through the polar chenille just to make sure that as many fibers are sticking out as possible. It also flares the polar chenille back a little bit, conform with the angle of the polar bear. You can use your bodkin to just sweep through the polar chenille, make sure that there's no fibers that are caught in underneath. It just gives the polar chenille a fuller look. Next step is to tie in some eyes, or eye stalks. I'm just using the Puglisi crab and shrimp eyes, and I'm preparing them so that they sit on about a 45-degree angle out from the shank, and I'm tying them in on both sides of the shank so that they're about 1/2 inch long. Once the eyes are tied in, I have 3 pre-prepared guinea feathers that I just use hardest hull and glue the feathers for durability. And at this point I tie in the first one on the top of the shank, and then tie in another piece of polar chenille ahead of my shellback and wrap forward, again about another 1/3 of the way forward on the shank. You'll see that the first piece of shellback is extending back right over the top of the shank and extends to about the end of the trailer. Tie the polar chenille off and clip the tag. At this point we want to tie in a second piece of shellback, again right on the top of the shank, so that it's parallel with the first piece. This one you want to be about 1/4 of an inch shorter from the end of the first piece of shellback. Just make sure that it angles up slightly away from the body of the fly. Just give the fly a good profile. Then tie in another piece of UV polar chenille in orange and just wrap forward on the shank of the hook. See that they're kind of even spacings from the rear of the shank to the front of the shank. I'm moving forward in about 1/3 sections, maybe a little bit of less, just to leave a little bit of clear shank right behind the eyes. If you find it's easier working with the polar chenille as it gets shorter, you can use a pair of hackle pliers as well. Just wrap it off. Just a couple of good strong wraps, make sure everything's good and tight. And you tie in your third piece of shellback, which is the orange guinea, which is being glued. And again, you want to tie it in just a little shorter than your second piece. And just make sure all three are just kind of angled up away from the shank of the hook. For that, I could just use a bodkin or some other pointed tool. Once we've got that, we want to tie in our first piece of rhea, which I use a darker color for my under rhea. And I use a shorter rhea for this as well. You'll see it's kind of a dark burnt orange with shorter fibers. The tip of a rhea feather, or the top, 3 or 4 inches is very suitable for this, because it gives you very good stiff, short fibers, and they tend to be a little darker as well. I just want to wrap forward on the shank with my rhea, and with the rhea, always remember to make sure that your stripped rhea, you test it before you tie it in to make sure that it's going to angle back on the fly. You'll see here the fibers do have an angle to them, and you want them to sweep backwards or towards the rear of the fly. After I've got 3 or 4 wraps in of this short dark rhea, I just want to carefully tie off, making sure you don't get any rhea fibers under the thread, and clip the tag. At this point I want to take a long orange piece of rhea with very long fibers and tie it in right ahead of the burnt orange or darker rhea. Make sure again that you test to make sure that the fibers are going to wrap so that they sweep back on the fly. And before you wrap the rhea on the shank of the hook, or pardon me, the Waddington shank, that you put a little bit of Zap-A-Gap just to add some durability. And just wrap forward, making sure that you're moving forward and not catching any of the previous wraps underneath, which will damage the rhea. Wrap forward. Each successive wrap should be right ahead of the last one. Slower is better in this case, just to make sure when you're wrapping the rhea, it's good to be careful just to make sure that you're not making any mistakes, ruining the rhea in the Zap-A-Gap or breaking stem. And you'll see how the first piece of rhea, the shorter fibers, act as very much as a support for the longer, more flowing fibers, so that the fly keeps a high profile or a bulbed look in the water. And I wrap the orange all the way forward until I get up to the V-chain eye. If you need to, just take your bodkin and clean up the rhea. If it's getting caught up, sometimes the longer fibers will do that. They'll kind of get caught in amongst themselves. You can just carefully take your bodkin and just sweep it through the fibers, just so that it clears them and they're laying down the length of the fly. You see, I'm just taking a little bit more time, being careful. 20 or 30 seconds extra at this point. It makes a difference of the fly having a better appearance is well worth it. Once I'm up to my bead chain eyes, I just carefully wrap through the rhea, tie it off, making sure that I don't catch any of the fibers in underneath the thread, and then just clip off the tag and rhea. Okay, next step is to tie in our cheeks, and those are just grizzly saddles, which I've pre-colored with an orange Pantone marker, and I just turn the fly on its side and tie in the first one, which goes right down the side of the fly. And just position it so that it comes right down behind the eyes and down the side. And you'll see that the length I run about an inch longer than the end of the trailing firewire. You just go and repeat on the other side of the fly so that you've got good looking highlight cheeks on both sides. And I want to start a dubbing loop right behind the eyes, or the bead chain eyes. And then I use a dubbing tool for this, and I'm using orange ice dub. Just use very small amounts down the length of your dubbing loop until it's about 4 inches long. This gives enough material to give a good egg-like looking head. But you don't want too many or too big of clumps in the dubbing loop, otherwise it affects the look of the fly. See, I'm just putting small pieces of material in. Once I've got the amount of material that I'm looking for, I spin the dubbing loop. However, I want to angle it forward so that it's away from the rhea, otherwise I can catch my rhea in my dubbing loop and damage the rhea fibers. You don't want to spin this super tight. You want to kind of keep everything a little bit fuzzy. You don't want a tightly compressed head. It doesn't give as good a look to the fly. You just wrap forward a couple of times until you get up to the bead chain, making sure that everything's swept back. And then I just X my dubbing loop through the bead chain eyes just to cover everything up. And then wrap ahead of the eyes once or twice. It gives a nice swept, tapered, egg-like looking head. And I just wrap off my dubbing loop with my thread. After clipping my thread, I whip finish a nice tapered head, making sure that the eye of the fly is clear, and then clip the tag and give the entire thread head a good soak with hard as hull head cement. Before you head cement it, make sure that all of the fibers are clear from the fly. Once that's done, your general practitioner intruder is ready to go.